Today's Europa Universalis 5 video is a trade guide in which I'll explain all those statistics to you, using the simplest language possible so that even a 5-year-old could understand it, with examples and by showing the right strategies, including the latest changes. And yes, the knowledge I present here is still valid for older versions of EU5. And if you found this video, for example, a year after its publication and it's still available, that means the information here is still up to date. And I haven't seen the need to make a new guide. Smaller changes will be updated in the pinned comment under this video. Welcome Imperialist, Lucas here, who will also remind you that the partner of this channel is ENEBA, a good place to buy games because there are tons of discounts, and you'll find the latest promo code in the description of this video along with the link needed for it to work. And if you plan to buy EU5 or other Paradox games, I'd be grateful if you did so using my affiliate link, which is pinned in the description of this video. Thank you in advance, Lucas! As you remember, the smallest administrative unit in this game is a location. And every single location in the world belongs to some market. Yes, even locations found in uncolonized territories belong to a specific market. The entire world is divided into markets from the very start of the game. However, these markets are not fixed. They change practically throughout the entire playthrough. This is mainly influenced by one statistic called market access. You can find it exactly here, right next to control, in every information panel of a given location. This mechanic affects many very important things. And step by step. First, it determines which market each location belongs to. You can see this when hovering over the market access icon, which appears for every location. Here a list expands, showing market attraction for that location. And the location always belongs to the first market on the list. All this is recalculated monthly, so yes, locations can change the market they belong to. But when you take a closer look at the numbers, market access does not match market attraction. And that's because a location is additionally modified by the attraction of the market it currently belongs to. And many other statistics influence market attraction itself. These are best divided in your mind into national bonuses, which include prestige bonuses, technology bonuses, privileges, and government forms. Prestige is easiest to gain, of course, by humiliating a country in a war. And the last very unclear statistic is trade income versus tax base. The only thing I am sure of is that this is neither the tax base you see in the economy panel under the balance tab, nor the trade income you also see there. The EU5 wiki describes this part exactly, and it still isn't very clear. For sure, taxation affects this statistic, because when I turn it off, these percentages rise to a maximum of 5%. When I disable all my trade and restore taxes, the statistic disappears altogether. On the other hand, when you have very unprofitable trade, this statistic becomes negative. The highest I managed to get was minus 10%. Overall, nothing here makes any sense. Fortunately, this statistic has little impact on market attraction. Then we have local bonuses affecting market attraction, where development refers to the development of the location in which the trade center is situated, and you can find the exact development here. And similarly, the building bonus applies only to buildings in the location where the trade center is. That information appears right here when you hover over it. And of course the buildings we can construct to increase trade attraction. And yes, you build these only in the location that contains the trade center. Then comes another statistic, market protection, which is higher the more control you have in your location. But there are also national bonuses from technology, privileges, and government forms. However, these are much rarer than bonuses to market attraction. I've only seen them in republics, and later in the game another value appears, Mercantilism, which will also increase market protection. The opposite of this value is free trade, which reduces market protection. Honestly, I would go for Mercantilism when playing in an environment with many markets not belonging to my country, where I need to fight for every location. It also seems interesting for countries creating entire transmission networks between various markets worldwide and that can field large fleets. However, if I played a smaller country, such as Venice or later the Netherlands, used to form Holland but aiming to dominate foreign markets, free trade would be much stronger. But this protection statistic does not always appear. First, it shows up when you hover over the second entry on the list. The second case occurs when a location belongs to one country but is part of a market belonging to another country. But as you can see from these three values, market access is definitely the most important. And here at the very bottom, it is directly written how to increase market access. And I'll also show you, using the example of the Chomphon province, how all this is calculated. Because in principle, it works almost the same as proximity. Exactly the opposite, because you have such a route that leads from the starting location and passes from location to location until it reaches the location that is the trade center. Unfortunately, the game lacks a final summary of all this. You have to check each location to see what influences what, and you'll see that sea transport is much more efficient than transport between land locations. Here again, roads give bonuses, river transport upstream gives bonuses, but see how extremely efficient downstream river travel is. And more importantly, river and road bonuses stack together. There is also the mechanics of exiting and entering a port. And port costs are affected by port capacity, which you can see here. Sometimes, to increase market access, there's nothing you can do except create a new market in the economy panel or move the market capital to a better place, taking into account essentially the same parameters as for proximity. And yes, a good practice is to have your capital also serve as your trade capital. Otherwise, you can cause what I caused in my Khmer playthrough. My most profitable province does not have full market access. There was a saying that by teaching we learn the most. And unfortunately, these will affect the second most important thing that market access influences: the production efficiency of raw output from all buildings and your profit from RGOs. And these two things must be clearly distinguished, and they are well captured in this part of the tooltip. When it comes to production buildings, the matter is very simple because everything is well described in the tooltip. When you hover over any production building, market access appears here, and then you can check the exact production by hovering over the icon of the relevant product. And it's clear that my base production, 1 per level, was reduced, actually multiplied by 0.73. Which is exactly the market access value for this location. So instead of producing 18 units of moonshine, I am producing barely 13. Pathetic waste. And it's simply very inefficient. It's a bit more complicated when looking at the RGOs tooltip. Here, market access is nowhere to be found, but the previous tooltip talked about profit, so you hover and check if it's true, and there's not a single word about market access. Then you hover over the icon and market access has no influence on anything. So how do you check if it's true? The same province when market access is 73% versus 100%. You can see the difference. To check this, I just moved the market center because that action is instantaneous. And thanks to this, you have proof that I'm telling the truth. I was very surprised that market access does not affect how much raw material you extract from an RGO or how much goes to the market. This is even clearer when comparing the market before and after moving it. Exactly the same amount of raw material enters the market. Another thing market access determines is the order in which locations receive access to raw materials from the market and to food supplies from the market. So if a location has low market access, it may run out of food and may also run out of raw materials needed for production. That's why you want to place your processing buildings in locations that first have high control, because you earn the most from them, but you must also ensure the highest possible market access, so that they do not run out of input materials, receive them first, and so that final production is as efficient as possible. Since patch 1.10, market access will also be increased by trade buildings. In rural areas, these will be market villages. And as I said, I will update this kind of information in the pinned comment, so it's worth checking there. So yes, now you know what determines that a given location belongs to a given market and what else is tied to it. However, another question immediately arises. How does a raw material like iron extracted in Zgierz reach my tool-producing workshops in Krakow? Because it's quite a long journey. However, before I move on to the topic of goods flow, let's quickly go over these 5 concepts, because they will keep appearing. Where the two most important statistics are trade capacity and trade advantage. Trade capacity is a statistic that allows you to increase the amount of goods transported between at least 2 different markets. If we're talking about transporting goods inside a single market, this statistic doesn't matter. Information about trade capacity can be found in many places. Personally, I most often use this tooltip when hovering over a specific market, and here I can see my trade capacity. In this case, as the Commonwealth. If I click on the market, I am taken to its panel in the economy section. There, trade capacity is located here, and when I click it again, I am taken to the specific trade occurring within the market, where I can fully automate trade inside a single market, provided I haven't set a global option earlier. Moving this slider left or right determines how much of the trade you handle manually or is automated. And now, to show you how this trade capacity is used, I will leave myself some of it. I can use trade capacity to import missing goods into the Krakow market. In the other direction, I can filter which goods I have the most of and try to sell them through the export action. And conveniently, I have a huge overproduction of jewelry, and global demand for it is very high, which you can see from the green color. And now, the most important part. Different goods require different amounts of trade capacity to transport one unit. Fortunately, jewelry only needs half a point. But there are much heavier goods, such as elephants, where transporting one unit requires as much as 5 points of trade capacity. You can also check the transport cost by hovering over any good that interests you, right here. However, this is the base value and it increases with the distance the goods must be transported. So the further you send the goods, the more trade capacity you will need to transport a single unit. This is barely noticeable for light goods like jewelry, but for something like elephants, it becomes significant. That's why the closer the trade, the more efficient it is. Light goods are often worth exporting far, but heavy goods are usually traded between neighboring markets. Unfortunately, I found this information in the tooltips only here, quite deep, because you first need to establish the trade route to see how unprofitable it becomes with distance. For some reason, when you try to create the trade route, this information is missing. Of course, you can guess it when looking at the quantity being transported together with trade capacity usage. Trade capacity within a single market can be increased directly by building structures such as marketplaces, which can be upgraded with technological progress, or by building market villages. There are also unique buildings such as the trading hub. The second method of increasing trade capacity, which applies to all markets you control, is boosting it via percentage modifiers. As usual, these are mostly modifiers from technology, privileges, government forms, but in this case also language strength. Language strength can be seen here. The more population and countries speak a given language, the stronger it is. The second extremely important statistic is trade advantage. It determines which country can export from a given market first. However, this statistic has no effect on local distribution inside a market. First, the market satisfies internal needs, which include the needs of the population living there and all raw materials required for buildings, whether for maintenance or production. And the order here is determined by market access, as I mentioned earlier. Only after these internal needs are met, if any surplus remains, it can be exported. And here trade advantage appears, showing the list of the 5 strongest countries usually. This list determines who has priority in trade, and only once the first country completes all the trade it wants can the others join in if anything remains. Trade advantage is increased basically the same way as trade capacity. Directly by building structures, marketplaces in cities and market villages in rural areas. Or if the market has sea access, you can send ships to increase trade advantage via naval presence. Naval presence is especially useful when you want to take over another country's market and seize all of its surplus goods. Then at the national level, you increase trade advantage through percentage modifiers. Here, the satisfaction of your burger estate is very important. It's generally good to keep their approval above 50%. Though, as always, there are laws, privileges, and technological upgrades that can increase it. And alright, I have described both mechanics in terms of markets you control, but you can also increase these statistics on markets not belonging to you. Usually you do this by constructing 2 specific buildings from the burger category. Both these buildings increase the 2 statistics we just discussed. To build a trade office, you need at least plus 100 relations with the target country, and then you can build it in a town or city with port access. For the overseas trading post, it's enough to have higher power projection than the target country, and you can check your power projection here, though only in coastal rural locations. There is also an option to force trade redirection, specifically to take 50% of a country's trade advantage and trade capacity. But first, you must be an economic hegemon. And second, the countries probably need to be small. I don't know why I can't force France. A very similar action can be performed on your vassal. Though my favorite tactic, one I've shown many times, is to take over a good region within a market, meaning one with lots of population so I can build many towns and cities, and in them a ton of marketplaces. Then I have a huge amount of trade capacity and trade advantage, allowing me to dominate that market. The next statistic is trade range, meaning how far your trade can reach from a specific market. It is calculated not from your country's capital, but from the location that serves as the trade center, and not to the border of another market, but to its center. You increase this statistic mainly through scientific research. Sometimes privileges or laws can also increase it. Sometimes you can bypass distance limitations by building a chain of trade routes between various markets. Trade maintenance, or more precisely, the cost of maintaining a given trade route. It only exists when we're talking about trade between markets. Inside a single market, there is no such cost. After the last patch, this statistic became important. Previously, it could be ignored. every trade route you create, whether it's an export route marked in orange or an import route marked in blue, has a base upkeep cost of half a ducat per 1 point of trade capacity. And unfortunately, monarchies and theocracies have a very hard time reducing these costs. Merchant republics, on the other hand, have it much easier. In general, merchant republics have huge trade bonuses right from the start of the game. Trade efficiency. This is a pure bonus applied when selling goods either on your own market or on foreign markets. You can examine this mechanic exactly in the Economy Trade tab, and by hovering over any good, you'll see it doesn't affect purchase price, only the selling price, both for imports and exports. Trade efficiency is increased mainly through technological development, privileges and laws. And now, knowing all these concepts, I can answer your question about how the distribution of raw materials and goods works across the entire world. All raw materials produced by RGOs first go to the market to which their locations belong. The same applies to production buildings. Everything they produce goes to the market that the location belongs to. And within the market to which the locations belong, the first to gain access to these goods are the populations living in those locations. All of this must be satisfied first, as well as all goods needed to maintain production in buildings or necessary for their operation. And the order of local access to these goods is determined by market access, not, contrary to what some guides claim, by the first country on that list. I think I myself once made this mistake, so I apologize in advance. And only when all those needs I just mentioned have been satisfied does that list begin to matter. The first country on that list has the right to export all kinds of goods from that market as the first in line, which means the second country on the list may receive nothing at all, or the goods available for it to trade may no longer be as profitable. To be able to export goods from a given market, surplus production of that good must exist. If we have zero or negative supply, the good cannot be exported, because this usually means that local needs have not been met, so nothing remains for export. And this is regardless of the amount of that good stored in the warehouse. However, once we have even the smallest surplus, the good can begin to be exported, theoretically in any quantity. Which may cause the situation I created here with cannons. Suddenly I'm exporting far more than is produced in this market, which leads to the warehouses being emptied, the price rising shortly after, and in theory the export at that level continues until one of two situations occurs. I am ignoring the unprofitability of such an action in most cases. The first situation is that the exporting country's warehouse empties. Then the amount of exported weapons will drop to the maximum number remaining after satisfying local needs. The second situation is the target country's warehouse becoming full, which is already visible when I switch to the Tunisian market. The warehouses have been filled and now the import will start to fall, and the order in which Tunis buys goods will be determined by price. So yes, we now have a third scenario in which this trade may stop when our price becomes simply unprofitable and no one wants to buy from us. And despite using a very large amount of trade capacity, we are realistically transporting only 3 units and losing a lot of money. This list with trade advantage also matters when we want to import a good from a given market, because it may turn out that the good I want is being exported by Sweden, as the first country on that list, in such large quantities to someone else, that nothing remains for me. And regarding imports, we can import any good that is within the range of our market, regardless of whether it will be profitable or not. However, whether the import actually happens depends on that list and on the warehouse levels of that good in both countries. Because as I mentioned, the good may run out. It may also happen that your own warehouses become full. So you could say that in terms of trade, it will continue until the warehouse is either emptied or filled. And the size of these warehouses is influenced by only a single building, I've seen no others, and it can be built only in a location that is a trade center. But let's assume success. The import happened, the goods reached the target market, which can be confirmed here in the tab showing all trade occurring within the market. Or when you hover over a specific good, you can also confirm that imports into that market are happening. And the distribution of this resource locally works in the same way I explained earlier through market access. Now, let's also consider another scenario where I am the owner of a market, for example the Genoese market, as Genoa, to which many more countries belong. Genoa is also the most important player in this market, which means it will be the first to export all goods produced by participants of this market. This means that Genoa can sell goods produced abroad, such as selling Milanese cloth. But for example, I cannot export such quantities of goods needed for cloth production that Milan becomes unable to produce it. Such a situation could only occur if those goods were being consumed by my own buildings and in such amounts that Milan would run out of them because I have 100% market access, while Milan's location has 88%, so it is lower in priority. But another scenario is also possible. For example, if the market has a surplus of silk, then as Genoa I could export it in large quantities, causing a significant increase in its price, which might result in Milan suddenly no longer earning money on that building. And AI nations often demolish unprofitable buildings. And this basically leads us to the topic of how prices in the market are formed. In reality, everything is very simple, described in this tooltip, and the formula for everything is even available on the wiki page, but generally, the larger the surplus, the more the price will fall, and the more demand exceeds supply, the more the price will rise. I admit I was a bit surprised that warehouse levels of a country do not affect this, so you simply have to be careful when constructing additional buildings or RGOs, because too many of them may cause the price of a given good to collapse. It is probably best to aim for a level where demand and supply are at least balanced, or where there is only a small surplus of that good. I would aim for a large surplus only in the case of goods that are food, which I will discuss in a moment, or in a situation where we can export large quantities of that good to other markets, because exports will increase demand. From that formula, you can also see that there is a type of trade in this game we cannot directly influence, and it is performed by the burghers. And it is difficult to say, because I found no information on this anywhere, how this trade performed by burghers is then divided among all estates, because each estate receives trade income, or whether the income from trade performed by burghers goes only to that social estate. There is a privilege that increases trade capacity for burghers, but personally I rarely use it, because I don't want to reduce my own trade capacity. What is also very clear in that formula is that the trade performed by burghers has far less impact on price formation than the trade performed by us as the player or the automation. So now that you know how prices are formed, let's talk about how much you actually earn from this trade, because it's not the amounts displayed here. In every tooltip of a specific market, you have information on how much you, as a country, earn from trade. You, as the ruler, only receive a percentage of the revenues displayed here from all markets. And this percentage is equal to your crown power. It is that simple. And only that amount appears in your budget in this place. You have the exact information in the tooltip when you hover over each good. In this regard, merchant republics have a huge advantage, because this government type adds as much as plus 25% plus your crown power. So Venice does not actually take 13% of trade profits, but nearly 40% in reality. Yes, merchant republics are a bit OP when it comes to trade. So yes, markets have a very large impact on the flow of goods, but not only that, because within markets, for example, we also handle food distribution. And specifically it works like this, and I'll explain it to you using the example of a location, Krakow. And it works completely differently from the regular flow of resources, so pay close attention. First, the population looks for food in the given location. In this case, Krakow has almost minus 200 food, which means that the population then starts looking for food within the province. But this province unfortunately also has negative 551 food, which means the population cannot find food here either, and only then does it purchase food from the market. You can see this in the budget tab. The food is being purchased at a very low price. Literally, this is the lowest price you can get. Now, using the example of Pristina, here the location is missing around minus 200 food, but the food is found within the province. That's why Pristina is not on that list. This entire mechanic has been described by Paradox in this place. Of course, when locations buy food from the market, they do so using market access, in the order determined by it. So ideally, within a province, the perfect situation is when you have some locations that produce a lot of food. However, this is not always possible, which applies to Krakow. Here, I don't have a single location capable of producing food, although there is one building that provides food, fruit orchards. Cheap food and a large supply of it are important because they strongly affect population growth. But the food storage is calculated at the province level, not the market level. In towns and cities, food storage is effectively increased by granaries. In rural areas, these are peasant-type buildings, for example, market villages, fishing settlements, or farm settlements. Another mechanic influenced by markets is population migration. It happens only within the same market. It does not occur between two or more different markets. Literally, if I wanted the population of the Gdansk market to migrate to the Krakow market, I would have to delete one of those markets. This is clearly described in the tooltip. Let me repeat again regarding societal needs. Remember that they are fulfilled within the market, not within the country. I know many of you often struggle to distinguish this. It's also worth mentioning that when you designate a location as a market center, it receives very large bonuses. And each additional market you own within your country grants you those bonuses. As the market owner, you can also perform a number of actions. With the embargo action, you can exclude a country from the market, literally kick it out, which means that those locations will move to the next market on the list, and that market often has lower market access, which means you kill the RGO income of that country and reduce its production efficiency. On the other hand, you can grant preferred market access, which increases the attraction of all of that country's locations by 20% toward your market. Meaning, you can increase the effective reach of your market at the expense of other nations belonging to neighboring markets. If within your country you have locations belonging to a market whose center is in another country, you can either conquer the location that is the current market center or force the relocation of the market center to one of your locations. After that, such a market can be destroyed, which may significantly weaken your opponent economically. And now, summarizing all the knowledge you received in this episode regarding markets, I would sum it up as follows. It is worth creating new markets, but only while considering a few things. First, you need to pay attention to control and its correlation with market access. When market access starts becoming lower than your control, I would consider creating another market. Because originally your entire production hub will be located where you have high control and high market access, and you will avoid producing in places with low control. Because even if the buildings there have 100% market access, meaning no production penalties, low control will reduce your tax income. Another situation in which I would consider creating a new market occurs in border regions. When locations in your country, due to low market access, start joining another market that you do not control. Then goods from RGOs or products from buildings will go to that market, not yours. The third situation is creating several of your own markets between which you transport raw material and earn money this way. But this concept is strongly tied to this statistic, trade maintenance cost, and the weight of transported goods. In some cases, like in Castile, I think that it is sometimes worth deleting one of the markets, especially early in the game, because you usually have very limited control. Doing so allows you to trigger population migration from the north of the country to the south, where it is more needed. When creating a new market, you must do it wisely and meet the condition of having a city or a town in which you establish the new market. You can also do it on rural territory if the market access of that location is below 25%. And now, first, I think that the capital of the market and the capital of the country should be exactly the same location. Second, the minimum requirement for creating a new market is establishing it in a city that has the maximum level of marketplace. Then I would add at least 2 towns and eventually 2 cities and also upgrade their marketplaces to the maximum. This is so the new market doesn't choke itself and suddenly run out of trade capacity. When choosing locations for a new trade center, I would follow these criteria. The lower course of a river, ideally at the river mouth, because the river transport bonus is massive. A network of roads around it, though topography and vegetation do not matter. I see no indication that they influence distance from the market. Unfortunately, the tooltip doesn't provide precise information, and I also don't see anything in the forest tooltip suggesting it affects market access. So in this regard, choosing a new market capital is a bit easier. Additionally, the market map helps pick the next location, because the brighter the color on the map, the higher the market access. The darker the shade, the lower the market access. So if there's a bottleneck here, you should look somewhere in this area for a new market center. Overall, I would divide markets into 2 categories. First, the main market, one that has very high control over its locations. This will be your country's factory, where you place production buildings that will process raw materials into final goods. And then all the auxiliary markets, where I would focus mainly on expanding RGOs and transporting raw materials to the main market. The main market will then send final goods to the auxiliary markets. As for trade itself, it's worth fully automating it. In my opinion, automation is a very good option, because otherwise you'll go insane. There are dozens of trade routes later in the game, and the AI handles selling raw materials at the highest possible price quite well. However, yes, I still set some trade routes myself. Mostly import routes bringing in raw materials from my auxiliary markets or foreign markets, which my production buildings need. Because I want input goods at the lowest possible price, so the building earns more money. And funnily enough, the auto system is pretty good at filling up storage in my auxiliary markets or on foreign markets when it comes to meeting demand for final products. Automation, however, cannot handle creating chain routes. So if I wanted to export something from Krakow to Alexandria, I would need to create a trade route from Krakow to Lviv, Lviv to Kaffa, Kaffa to Bursa, and only then from Bursa to Alexandria. The automation will not handle such a chain. And yes, when creating such routes, remember trade advantage and trade capacity, you must have them on those markets. It works exactly the same the other way around if I wanted to transport something from Alexandria to Krakow. And basically, all these actions are just a part of what can be done to maximize tax income, goods production, and so on. And I will show you exactly how to build such an economy in the guide that will be released next week.